I want you to picture this scene, because I think about it often. A man sits at the head of a long table, papers spread before him, pen in hand. He has told himself this is a formality. He has told himself she will cry. He has told himself that the only thing left between them is the signatures. Then she walks in, and everything he told himself turns quietly, completely wrong. This is the story of Michelle Vasquez, a woman who was counted out, signed away, and declared finished. And what she built in the silence. If you can already feel Michelle's silence breaking your heart, subscribe now, because the moment the Duke realizes what he destroyed will leave you breathless. And if you think she should have fought for herself, tell me in the comments why. See, I read every single one. The autumn of 1819 had been the season of Michelle Vasquez's greatest discipline and her most private devastation. At 22 years of age, she had entered Ashton House not on a wave of romantic triumph, but on the quiet, dignified terms of a strategic union, the kind society arranged with ledgers rather than letters. Her family's name carried history, but not fortune. Her father's influence, once respected in the southern counties, had grown thin at the edges, like old silk held too long to candlelight. And so she had come to the Duke of Ashton not as a prize, but as a solution for both parties. She was not, by the standards of that particular world, a conventional beauty. What she possessed was something harder to dismiss and easier to underestimate. A stillness. Dark hair drawn back simply, and was without artifice. Eyes the color of deep water, observant and patient. A posture shaped not by a governess's ruler, but by a woman who had learned early that dignity is the one inheritance no creditor can collect. Even then, in those first weeks at Ashton House, one had the distinct impression of standing near something quietly formidable, as though one were admiring a library and had not yet noticed that every book had been read. Duke Brian Ashton had not pursued her in the romantic sense. Men like him did not pursue. They decided. He had reviewed her family situation, consulted his solicitors, and determined that Michelle Vasquez represented a suitable correction to his public image. A cool, impeccably controlled man who required, at least in appearance, some evidence of human warmth. He needed a duchess who would not embarrass him, and she needed a name that would protect what remained of her family's standing. Society called it a sensible match. Michelle called it a beginning, and in her quiet way, she meant it. She had not come to Ashton House expecting love, but she had allowed herself to expect partnership. In those early months, there were moments, careful, contained but unmistakably real, that seemed to justify the hope. He had walked with her through the estate at dusk and not seemed bored by her questions about the tenant accounts. He had paused, just once, outside the room she had designated as a reading room for the estate workers' children, and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. One evening in the library, when she had been studying a pamphlet on inheritance law, and he had appeared in the doorway, that he had said, "You are thorough, Duchess." He had meant it as a compliment. She had taken it as one. He possessed, she believed then, the capacity to become someone she could trust. She had set herself to the work of the estate with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. She opened a small school for the workers' daughters, nothing grand, 3 mornings a week, a borrowed room, second-hand primers. She began corresponding with a woman in Edinburgh who was documenting property rights for wives under English law. She studied the Ashton ledgers not out of ambition, but because she understood instinctively that knowledge was the only form of protection a woman in her position could carry without arousing suspicion. She had been careful. She had been patient. She had been, she reflected later, dangerously hopeful. And then society began to count. It began the way such things always begin in those circles. Not with confrontation, but with silence that arrives where laughter used to be. A pause before her name at a dinner table, A letter replied to 3 days later than was customary. The way eyes moved to her waist before they moved to her face. She was 3 months pregnant, the child conceived, she knew with absolute certainty, within the first weeks of their marriage. But society does not traffic in certainty. It traffics in suggestion, in timing, in the particular cruelty of arithmetic performed publicly. Brian did not come to her with questions. He went to them, to the whispered calculations, the polite insinuations, the raised eyebrows of men whose own histories could not have survived similar scrutiny. He was a man ruled by order, by perception, by the great, terrifying architecture of what people thought. And people, apparently, thought enough. He did not raise his voice when he told her. That was the part she was never able to forget. He stood in his study, this very room, these very walls, with that terrible composure of his intact, and he explained in the measured tone of a man reviewing a contract clause that he was not prepared to acknowledge a child whose legitimacy he could not verify. His words were careful, his expression was controlled. The insult was surgical. The room did not witness it. No one applauded or gasped. It was a private verdict, delivered politely, like a foreclosure notice slid under a door. But it was a verdict nonetheless. Michelle Vasquez stood across from the man she had intended to build a life beside, and she understood, with the same quiet clarity that had always been her most unfashionable quality, that a marriage without trust is not a partnership. It is a prison with better curtains. She did not argue. She did not weep. She possessed already the evidence that could have silenced his doubt. Letters, dates, a physician's testimony she had quietly secured. She left it in the drawer where she had placed it. Some things, she had come to understand, cannot be proven to someone who has already decided not to believe them. She requested a quiet separation before her condition became visible to the world. Society declared her ruined. What society did not know was that she had already begun to build something it could not touch. And 2 years later, when the Duke of Ashton summoned her to sign the final divorce papers, expecting, by his own account, tears or pleas, or at the very least the satisfying sight of a woman diminished. She walked through those doors with the composure of someone who had spent 24 months becoming entirely, dangerously free. It happened at dinner. That was the detail Michelle would return to in the years that followed. Not what he said, but where he chose to say it. A formal dinner, 14 guests, 3 courses already served. The kind of evening where conversation moves in careful circles and no one says anything that cannot be safely repeated in a drawing room the following morning. She had expected a private conversation. She had prepared for one, had rehearsed, in the way methodical women do, a quiet and reasonable exchange behind a closed door. She had even allowed herself to believe he would ask her directly, and that she would answer, and that would be the end of it. Brian Ashton did not do quiet. He did composed. And composed, she was learning, could be its own form of violence. He waited until the table had settled between courses. That particular lull when wine has loosened everyone except the host, and attention tends to drift toward wherever power is seated. Then, without raising his voice, without any alteration in expression, he turned the conversation toward estate matters and remarked, almost parenthetically, as though noting the weather, that questions had arisen regarding the timing of certain developments, and that he was not, as yet, in a position to make any formal confirmations about the future of the Ashton line. The table understood perfectly. Michelle understood perfectly. The woman seated to her left stopped reaching for her wine glass. The man across from her developed a sudden, absorbing interest in his plate. No one looked at her directly. That was its own answer. The polite refusal of witnesses to acknowledge they had just watched something irreversible occur. Inside, she felt something collapse. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in novels, with a gasp and a hand to the chest. It was quieter than that. the careful, structural failure of a belief she had not known she still held. But her hands remained in her lap. Her posture did not change. She had, in the months of studying legal texts and estate accounts, learned one thing with absolute clarity. The law offered a wife without her husband's acknowledgement nothing. No standing, no claim, no protection that could not be revoked by the same signature that had given it. This was not a marriage. This was a verdict, and she had not been permitted to testify. She waited until the last guest had taken their leave. Then she found Brian in the hallway and spoke in a voice so steady it seemed to belong to someone who had already moved on. "I would like," she said, "to arrange a quiet separation." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The evidence was in the second drawer of her writing desk. A physician's letter, dated and signed, confirming the precise timing of her condition. 2 personal correspondences from her mother, written in the weeks following the wedding, that established with quiet certainty what any honest reading of the calendar would confirm, and a brief testimony, committed to paper at Michelle's careful request, from the midwife who had examined her in October. She had assembled it methodically, not in anticipation of a battle, but because she was a woman who understood that documentation was the only language the law reliably spoke. She read it once more the morning after the dinner. Then she placed it back in the drawer, turned the small brass key, and put the key in her pocket. She did not use it. This was the decision people would later find impossible to understand. Her own mother among them. "Why did you not fight?" they would ask, as though fighting was simply a matter of will, as though the institution she would have been fighting within had ever been designed to hear her. She had spent enough months studying the legal architecture of aristocratic marriage to understand its fundamental design. A wife's word, absent her husband's corroboration, carried the weight of sentiment, not evidence. She could have presented every document she possessed and still found herself subject to the interpretation of men who had already decided what to believe. A marriage without trust is not a battleground worth bleeding on. She left Ashton House on a Tuesday, before the first real sign of her pregnancy was visible to anyone who had not been looking carefully. She took what was legally hers, her dowry correspondence, her books, 3 trunks, and she departed for a small provincial estate in Wiltshire that had belonged to a great-aunt and had been quietly transferred to her name 2 months prior. As she had arranged that too, methodically, quietly, because she had always understood, even in hope, that a woman who plans for nothing is at the mercy of everything. Society declared her ruined within a fortnight. She was delivered of a son in March, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, attended by a local midwife and a woman she had already begun to employ as a teacher for the village children. There was no scandal in that room. There was only effort and exhaustion, and then the sudden, extraordinary weight of a child placed against her chest. She looked at his face for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, as though making a promise to someone who could not yet understand it, "We will never beg to be believed." 2 years is a long time to become someone new. It is also, Michelle discovered, barely enough. No, she began with the books, the ones she had carried from Ashton House in the bottom of her second trunk, beneath the winter linens where no one thought to look. Blackstone's legal commentaries, a Scottish treatise on women's property rights, a slim, quietly radical pamphlet on inheritance law that a woman in Edinburgh had written under initials rather than her name, because the world was not yet ready to take the argument seriously from someone it could identify. Michelle read them all. Then she wrote letters, careful, precise letters, to solicitors, to estate managers, to a banker in Bristol who had come recommended by her great-aunt's former accountant. She asked questions that women in her position were not expected to ask, in language that made clear she intended to act on the answers. Her dowry, and which Brian had never touched because he had never needed to, became the first stone of something deliberate. She invested in 2 wool merchants whose operations she had researched across 3 months of correspondence. She purchased a small interest in a printing concern in Bath that specialized in educational materials. She hired an estate manager, a practical, unsentimental woman named Mrs. Gareth, and together they made the Wiltshire property productive in ways its previous occupants had never attempted. The school came next. First 1 room, then 2, then a converted barn that she had repaired at her own expense. Girls from the village, daughters of farm workers, women in their 30s who had never been taught to read a contract and had paid for that absence in ways that could not be fully calculated. She taught property law alongside reading. She taught the difference between a lease and a deed alongside arithmetic. She taught, above everything, that knowledge was the one asset no husband, no court, and no reversal of fortune could legally remove from a woman's possession. They began calling her the lady who teaches others to stand. She did not correct them. In London, the reports arrived on Brian Ashton's desk with the regularity of estate correspondence, because that, officially, was what they were. A property manager's quarterly summary, tenant updates, community observations. He read them more carefully than he read anything else. A school, an investment return that his own solicitor found quietly impressive. A reputation spreading through 3 counties like something that could not be contained. And he set the latest report down on the same desk where he had once signed her separation agreement. For the first time since she had left, without tears, without argument, without even the courtesy of making his certainty feel justified, Brian Ashton felt something unfamiliar move through him. It took him a moment to identify it. Doubt, it turned out, arrives quietly, rather like she always had. Brian Ashton's life in Michelle's absence was perfect. He told himself this regularly, which was, had he been a more self-examining man, the first indication that something was wrong. Men who possess genuinely perfect lives rarely need to remind themselves of the fact. They simply live them the way one breathes, without annotation. His days ran with the precision of a well-maintained clock. Correspondence answered by 10. Estate meetings concluded by noon. Afternoons spent in the company of men whose conversation never surprised him. Evenings at his club where the same opinions circulated like the same decanters, and nights in rooms that were immaculate, ordered, and profoundly, architecturally silent. The silence had not bothered him at first. By the second winter, he had stopped noticing it. By the second spring, he was reading her reports twice. He would not have admitted this to anyone. The quarterly summaries from Wiltshire were, officially, routine correspondence, the kind of administrative document a man of his holdings reviewed briefly and filed without sentiment. And yet somehow they migrated from the filing cabinet to the corner of his desk, and from the corner of his desk to the top of it, and from the top of it to the drawer he opened most frequently, which was something he declined to examine closely. In October of the second year, he traveled to Wiltshire under the pretense of inspecting a neighboring property he had been considering acquiring. He told his secretary this. He told himself the same thing. He almost believed it. He found the school without difficulty. It was not hidden, which struck him as characteristic of her. Nothing about Michelle Vasquez had ever hidden. She had simply been consistently, inconveniently visible to anyone willing to look. He stood at the edge of the lane and observed through a window that had been left open to the mild afternoon air. Women seated at long tables, bent over documents. A younger girl reading aloud to an older one, correcting herself without prompting. Michelle moving between them, not performing authority, simply having it in the way that certain people do when they have stopped requiring anyone's permission. And then a child crossed the far end of the room. A boy. 3, perhaps 4 years of age, dark-haired, upright, with a quality of observation in his bearing that made Brian go very still without understanding why. The boy paused at a table and studied a document lying open there, with the particular focused stillness of someone reading something that mattered. Brian did not recognize what he was looking at, but something in his chest moved strangely. He returned to London the following morning and instructed his solicitor to prepare divorce papers. He told himself it was closure. It was, in fact, the last thing he could control. And some part of him, the part that had stood motionless on that Wiltshire lane, already knew the difference. London had prepared itself for a certain kind of woman. Society had spent 2 years constructing her in advance. The fallen Duchess, pale and diminished, arriving to sign away the last remnant of a life she had failed to keep. They had rehearsed their expressions of careful sympathy. They had selected, with the practiced instinct of people who feed on misfortune, precisely which drawing rooms would discuss it afterward, and in what order. Michelle Vasquez did not cooperate. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a carriage that was neither ostentatious nor apologetic. Simply well-appointed, the way things are when chosen by someone who no longer requires other people's opinions to confirm their worth. She wore deep green, not the Ashton colors, and which were burgundy and grey. She had worn those faithfully for the 18 months of their marriage, the way a woman wears a uniform she has been assigned. The green was her own selection. It suited her in the way that clothing suits people who have finally stopped dressing for rooms they no longer inhabit. Those who saw her on Grosvenor Street noted and later reported with some confusion that she did not look ruined. She looked finished, in the architectural sense, complete, as though the 2 years had not stripped something from her but added the final, defining layer that had always been intended. She did not call on anyone. She made no social appearances. She arrived, took rooms that belonged to her, and waited, with the composure of someone who has learned that patience is not the same as weakness, and that silence, and deployed correctly, is the loudest possible statement. Brian received word of her arrival the same afternoon. He had expected, and this was, in retrospect, a significant failure of imagination for a man who prided himself on accurate assessment, that seeing her again would restore his equilibrium, that the composed, untouchable quality she had acquired would dissolve at close proximity into something more familiar, something he could manage. He encountered her briefly in the hallway of his solicitor's office, where she had arrived punctually, and he, for the first time in recent memory, had not. She met his eyes with an expression he could not name. Not cold, not warm, simply clear, the way water is clear when it is very deep. She said, "Your Grace." Nothing else was required. He watched her move down the hallway and understood, with the particular clarity of a man standing at the edge of something irreversible, that he had spent 2 years preparing for the wrong woman to walk through that door. The divorce chamber doors closed behind them both. If this is the moment you've been waiting for, the fall of a proud duke, subscribe now. Because what walks through that door next will change everything, and if you still think he deserves forgiveness, you must defend him in the comments. The documents were already on the table when she sat down. Brian had arranged it that way, deliberately, precisely, with the same attention to atmosphere he brought to every negotiation he intended to win. The papers were centered. The pen was placed. 2 witnesses stood near the wall with the practiced invisibility of men paid to observe without reacting. So he had thought of everything. He had positioned himself standing, which gave him the advantage of height and the appearance of a man who had already moved on. Michelle sat across from him and folded her gloved hands on the table. She did not look at the documents. He waited for her composure to fracture, for the slight tremor in the jaw, the careful blinking that precedes tears, the small involuntary collapse that even the most disciplined women eventually produced when confronted with the formal architecture of their own losses. He had seen it before, in other rooms, other negotiations. He knew what surrender looked like when it was trying to look like dignity. She looked at him instead, directly, without performance. "You seem to be waiting for something, Your Grace," she said. He said nothing. He gestured toward the pen, but Michelle did not reach for it. "I want you to understand something first," she said, in the same tone one uses to explain something to a person capable of understanding it, if they would only try. "You cannot dismiss what you never took the time to know." The sentence landed in the room like a door closing in a very quiet house. Before he could construct a response, before the architecture of his composure could arrange itself into something sufficient, the door behind her opened. A nurse entered, and beside her, moving with the unhurried confidence of a child who has never been taught to make himself small, was a boy. Brian's attention moved to him with the involuntary precision of recognition before the mind has authorized it. The eyes arrived first, dark, direct, and set beneath a brow that furrowed slightly at the unfamiliar room with an expression that was not anxiety but assessment. Then the posture, straight, self-contained, instinctively still in the way of someone who observes before he speaks. The way Brian himself had stood in every room since the age of 4. The boy's gaze traveled the space methodically, the table, the papers, the witnesses, and then settled on Brian with a quality of calm attention that felt, impossibly, like being read. Brian heard himself speak. A simple question, the kind one asks a child to fill silence. The boy considered it seriously. Then he said, "My mother says a gentleman listens before he judges." The pen was still in Brian's hand. He became aware, distantly, that he had stopped breathing, that the room had rearranged itself around a truth he had spent 2 years constructing an elaborate architecture to avoid. He had not lost a wife. He had dismissed a family. And someone else, time, circumstance, her fierce and patient love, had already stepped into the space he had vacated. The witnesses were asked to leave. Brian did not say it unkindly. He simply turned to them with the measured authority of a man accustomed to clearing rooms, and they went, with the quiet relief of people who had been present for something they did not have the vocabulary to file correctly. The nurse took the boy into the hallway, and for the first time in 2 years, Brian Ashton and Michelle Vasquez were alone in a room together. He spoke first, as she had expected this. Men like him fill silence the way they fill every vacancy, with the instinct of someone who equates presence with control. He offered her everything. The title restored, publicly, with a formal statement to be circulated through the appropriate channels. The child's name recorded in the Ashton registry. Legitimate, protected, positioned as heir. A financial settlement, generous enough to confirm that this was not negotiation, but contrition. And finally, delivered in the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed sincerity without entirely achieving it, a public apology. He laid it out with the thoroughness of a well-prepared case. Michelle listened to all of it. Then she said, "He will inherit a future, not a correction." Brian stared at her. She continued, not with anger, which would have been easier for him to receive, but with the particular patience of a woman who has thought carefully about something for a very long time and is now simply reporting her conclusions. She told him what 2 years had taught her, that a woman who does not understand property law cannot protect her children, that a woman who cannot protect her children will always require someone's permission to survive, that the architecture of aristocratic marriage, as currently constructed, was designed to make that dependency invisible until the moment it became catastrophic, and that the moment it became catastrophic was invariably the moment a man decided he no longer believed her. She told him that trust, once structurally removed, cannot be restored by title, that a name offered as a correction is still a correction, and that her son had been raised to understand the difference between inherited status and earned integrity, and that she did not intend to confuse him on the matter now. She told him all of this without raising her voice. When she finished, Brian said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Do you hate me?" She looked at him with that expression he had never been able to name, clear and deep and entirely her own. "No," she said simply. "I've simply stopped needing to feel anything about you at all." It was, he understood, the most devastating thing she could have said. She signed the papers without ceremony. Not with hesitation, not with the theatrical pause of a woman performing grief for an audience. Simply with the clean, deliberate movement of someone completing a task they have long been prepared for. The pen touched the document. Her name appeared. She set the pen down with the same quiet finality with which she had, 2 years prior, turned a small brass key and placed it in her pocket. It was done. She rose, smoothed her green dress, and walked to the door where her son was waiting. His hand in the nurse's, his eyes moving immediately to his mother with the uncomplicated confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt she would return. She took his hand. She did not look back. London, to its credit, adjusted quickly. Society had always been less interested in justice than in trajectory, and Michelle Vasquez's trajectory had become, by any observable measure, the more compelling story. The women she had educated sent letters. The merchants she had invested with spoke her name in rooms where it had once been spoken only in pity. And the school in Wiltshire expanded. A second building, funded partly by donations from women who had read about it in a gazette and understood, without requiring explanation, precisely what it meant. She did not return to Ashton Colours. She did not need to. Brian received the signed documents by messenger that same evening. He read them at his desk. The same desk, the same room, the same precise arrangement of objects that had always communicated order and authority, and the particular permanence of a man who had never doubted his own foundations. He sat for a long time afterward. Eventually, he walked through the house, past the formal dining room where 14 guests had once witnessed something he had told himself was a necessary decision, past the library where she had studied documents he had not thought worth understanding, and past the room that still held, faintly, the ghost of a purpose she had given it before he made it unnecessary for her to stay. He stopped beneath the portrait gallery. Generations of Ashton men looked back at him, composed, titled, impeccably preserved. Not one of them could tell him what he had done. In the silence, he imagined, or perhaps simply understood, a child's voice somewhere unreachable, addressing a man who had been present, consistently, quietly, irreplaceably present. Not him. He would have survived her tears. He had survived many things. Negotiation, loss, the ordinary cruelties of a life lived at the intersection of power and pride. But her indifference, her calm, complete, meticulously constructed indifference, that was the thing that would not leave the room. If this story made you feel the cost of pride, please subscribe now, because the next Duchess's silence will be even more devastating. And if you are one of the few who refuses to subscribe, tell me in the comments why you would walk away from a story that speaks about dignity, truth, and the price of being unheard.